for most of history, people didn't think of sexuality the way we do today. There were no strict boxes like gay or straight. Relationships were often about beauty, desire, and connection, not gender. In fact, many ancient and medieval societies, including the Ottomans, didn't even have a single word for homosexuality as we know it today. In the Ottoman world, a man could desire a woman and a man at the same time, and no one would call him anything other than a man. Society's view wasn't based on the partner's gender but rather on the roles in the relationship: who was the lover, who was the beloved, who was active, who was passive. Sounds shocking, right? Because we've been taught that same-sex love has always been taboo. But that's not true. The Ottoman Empire, one of the longest-lasting empires in history, is a perfect example. For hundreds of years, it quietly accepted same-sex relationships, especially among the elite. Lovers walked in the palaces. Poets wrote verses for their beloved boys. Soldiers kept young male companions without fear. But of course, history never stays the same. What was once ordinary eventually became sinful. So how did this empire rise? And why did its view on love change so drastically? Let's dive into the heart of the empire first. The Ottoman Empire wasn't just any kingdom. It was one of the most powerful empires in the world, lasting from the 14th century all the way to the early 20th century. Imagine a massive territory stretching across Southeast Europe, Western Asia, and North Africa. Istanbul, formerly Constantinople, was its glittering capital. From the grand halls of Topkapi Palace, sultans ruled over millions of people, dozens of languages, and a rich tapestry of cultures. Under leaders like Suleiman the Magnificent, the empire reached its golden age. Suleiman wasn't just a ruler, he was a lawmaker, a poet, and a lover of the arts. His reign brought extensive legal reforms, making Ottoman law strong for generations. But while the empire was strict in politics and religion, it was surprisingly flexible in personal relationships. Here's the strange truth: the Ottomans didn't categorize people by sexual orientation. Instead, they looked at roles. In Ottoman culture, the words asik, lover, and masuk, beloved, were more important than gay or straight. A man could admire the beauty of another man without questioning his masculinity. Love poems written by some of the greatest Ottoman poets openly described male beauty. Inside the Topkapi Palace, things were even more complex. Hundreds of boys, called İc Oglanmari, were kept in the palace schools. They were trained for military or administrative roles, but they also became companions to the sultans and high officials. Venetian envoys visiting the palace wrote about the 500 beautiful youths, aged 8 to 20, living under strict guardianship but serving as the delights of the palace. It's important to understand this wasn't seen as immoral back then. To the Ottomans, it was simply part of life. However, there was still a limit. Marriage was only recognized between a man and a woman, and same-sex love was tolerated socially but never given the same legal standing. Even with these limits, the empire remained remarkably open compared to later centuries. Among the elite, especially the janissaries and wealthy men, homosexual relationships were common. Many older men formed deep bonds with younger companions, often writing poetry or gifting wealth to their beloveds. But remember, this was a pre-modern world. The idea of homosexual identity didn't exist. A man who loved boys might later marry a woman, have children, and still occasionally have male lovers. No one thought of it as a contradiction. So what changed? Western influence. By the 19th century, the empire began modernizing its laws to match European powers. In 1858, the Ottoman Penal Code was revised. Suddenly, public acts against modesty became punishable by prison and fines. What had been tolerated quietly for centuries now became risky. And worse, as European morality seeped in, Ottoman society started to see same-sex love as shameful. This was the beginning of the end for the old Ottoman tolerance. But before we get into the decline, Let's talk about how homosexuality was actually lived and practiced in the empire. Picture the streets of Istanbul in the 18th century. Music drifts from coffeehouses. Poets recite verses under dim lanterns. Among the crowds are men admiring both women and boys. It was an open secret. Homosexuality in the Ottoman Empire wasn't illegal for most of its history. In fact, among the elite, it was even fashionable. Elite men, high-ranking officials, wealthy merchants, and janissaries often kept young male lovers. These boys, often seen as beautiful and delicate, were called kosek when they danced and entertained. Their long hair, graceful movements, and androgynous beauty fascinated the audience. But here's the key difference: the younger beloved, Masuk, was admired for his beauty and innocence, while the older lover, Asik, was seen as the active, dominant partner. This wasn't about sexual orientation. It was about age, beauty, and social role. Janissaries, the empire's elite soldiers, famously engaged in same-sex relationships. Many believed it created strong bonds of loyalty among troops. Even sultans themselves were rumored to have male favorites. However, it was also hidden in layers of secrecy. While it was tolerated, it wasn't something openly celebrated in public. It existed in private gardens, palaces, and poetry. Venetian diplomats who visited Istanbul wrote shocking reports. In the palace, hundreds of boys aged 8 to 20 were kept for education and service. Each group was guarded by eunuchs. These boys rarely left the palace until they were deemed ready for official positions. But many also became the intimate companions of the sultan or high-ranking officials. This system wasn't unique to the Ottomans. Similar practices existed in Persia, the Arab world, and even medieval Europe. But the Ottomans made it a structured part of palace life. Yet, despite this quiet acceptance, there was always a double standard. A man could admire another man, but he was still expected to marry a woman and produce heirs. As time passed, this fragile balance began to break. By the late 19th century, everything shifted. Modernity brought new moral codes. Women, once hidden in harems, became more visible, and female beauty replaced male youth as the main object of desire. One Ottoman statesman, Ahmed Sevdet Pasha, famously said, "Women lovers have increased, while boy beloveds have disappeared. It is as if the people of Lot have been swallowed by the earth." Slowly, society turned away from its old customs. By the 20th century, homosexuality was no longer a quiet norm. It became a crime, a source of shame. But in this fading world, there were still stories of true love, like the tragic romance of Taib and Tahir. Taib and Tahir weren't just lovers. They were symbols of a vanishing time. Their story began when they were traveling to Egypt to become dervishes, mystics devoted to a life of prayer and wandering. But fate had other plans. On their journey, they were captured by Christian noblemen. Normally, such captors would have enslaved, tortured, or killed them. But instead, something unexpected happened. Their captors treated them with kindness. They gave them food, comfort, and affection. Slowly, Taib and Tahir fell in love with their captors. It was a love that defied not only cultural norms but also the boundaries between captive and captor. But love stories rarely end happily in a world of rules. When the authorities discovered this strange romance, they were horrified. To the Christian rulers, such a relationship was not just sinful, it was barbaric. They imprisoned both the Ottoman youths and their lovers. Taib and Tahir were eventually pardoned and freed. But freedom meant nothing without their beloveds. They refused to abandon them. In an act of pure devotion, they escaped imprisonment and reunited with their lovers. They even went further, they converted to Islam, so their love could continue without the restrictions of Christianity. But society wasn't ready for them. By the late 19th century, love like theirs was fading. Female lovers had replaced boy beloveds. And the old tolerance was disappearing. Their story ends in mystery. Some say they lived quietly together, hidden from the world. Others believe they were separated forever. What we do know is this: their love was real. And it was one of the last sparks of an era when love truly didn't care about gender. So what can we learn from this? There was a time, before modern morality, before Western influence, when the Ottoman Empire quietly allowed people to love without labels. Homosexuality wasn't celebrated, but it wasn't condemned either. It simply existed. Then came the laws, the shame, the fear. Ibn Tahir's love reminds us of a forgotten truth: love has always existed in every era, in every culture. It only becomes forbidden when society decides to label it that way.